for a thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. I want to go over the events of the last 18 hours or so, and then we'll field any questions. Yesterday, I got a call from Jared Porter about 5:30 indicating that there would be a story published by ESPN regarding a series of incidents involving a woman from Korea. For the first several hours before the story was published, we discussed it with Jared, got his side of the story. It wasn't until about 11 o'clock, a little before 11, about 10:15, that I actually got to see a copy of the story and did not see any video until this morning. It was pretty clear from the story that this was, a significant issue, and that we needed to deal with it appropriately. So the statement that we sent out last night was crafted largely before we had a chance really to read the story. At about 7:30 this morning, Steve Cohen and I had a conversation in which we agreed that the only course of action here was to terminate Jared, which was done, within the next 45 minutes. I have to say that with respect to this series of incidents involving Jared, those are the kinds of things that this organization, many others, find abhorrent and not tolerable in any shape or form. So we responded as, I think, quickly as we possibly could, given the fact that we needed to sort out the facts and deliberate on this, keeping in mind that, while there were two individuals involved in this situation, the woman who was victimized, and keeping in mind the extraordinary impact that this would have on Jared and his career. But nonetheless, we acted and decided this morning that he needed to be let go. I'm very sorry for the woman involved. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances we weren't aware of at the time that Jared was hired, and as I said, only learned last night. But suffice it to say, had we known about it in advance before Jared was hired, it would have been a disqualification. So with that as a little bit of background, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Sandy. And a reminder of our process to ask a question. If you'll use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask your question, please, during this afternoon's proceedings, if you would state your name and affiliation prior to your question. We'll begin. Steve, your line is open.
Hey, Sandy, Steve Gelbs from SNY. You mentioned last night that you first heard about this from Jared Porter around 5:30 and didn't get a chance to read the article until a little after 11. Did that initial conversation with Jared mislead you in any way? Was he either not forthcoming about everything, or did he say something different than what the actual report ended up being?
Look, I wouldn't say that Jared was misleading. I think that, however, that we didn't understand the full scope of this situation until we had a chance to read the article and ultimately also to see the video. I didn't get to see the article itself until it was actually published. which was in the 10:30 to 11 time frame. Talked to the writer about 10 o'clock and got 15 minutes from that point to complete a response, because we didn't want to be silent in the article. But to answer your question directly, I don't want to suggest that Jared was not totally forthcoming. On the other hand, the full breadth of the situation was not really apparent to us until the article was written and we had a chance to read it.
And Sandy, you mentioned a couple of times seeing a video. From our point of view, from our knowledge, we only saw screenshots that were released. Is there anything further that you did get a chance to see that perhaps wasn't disclosed to the public?
No, I think I've seen what you've seen, which was a video narrated by the writer of the written piece.
Got it. Okay, then one last thing. I know you didn't know Jared Porter prior to the interview process, but certainly from what you had said about the recommendations you had gotten and what so many of us have heard from people in baseball, it seems to have painted a certain picture of him. Just given what you thought you knew about Jared Porter, the person, what was your initial reaction when the full breadth of what took place came to light last night for you?
Well, look, I was shocked. We had references from a variety of organizations, a number of individuals, people who had known him for a long time, people who endorsed him, who knew him from his earliest days in college. There wasn't really a dissenting voice. So, from my standpoint, I was shocked, and eventually that gives way to disappointment and a little bit of anger. But this was a total surprise to us.
Disha, you are next. Your line is open.
Hey, Sandy. Disha Dosar, the Daily News. Just kind of how does Porter's past behavior change how you might hire staff members and treat them going forward?
Well, in terms of hiring, there is always a risk associated with hiring. Someone inside and out, and it's hard to know anyone inside and out today. So, from our standpoint, there was no disclosure of this conduct. I don't think we would have hired Jared if we'd known about the conduct beforehand. In fact, I know we wouldn't have. And the question is, should we have known? And, we did a background check. We asked the question, is there anything else we need to know? It wasn't pointed about social media or something of that sort. But, given the length of time that's transpired between the series of incidents and now, I'm confident that, this is not something that we should have known about, should have found out about it, had used other means to inquire, that we would have known about it. To my knowledge, none of the other organizations in which Jared was employed knew about this either. As far as how we treat employees going forward, Steve has talked about zero tolerance. And I think that, for incidents of this type, of this magnitude, or any incidents that approach this kind of magnitude, that's the response. Obviously, as in this case, we have to explore the facts, but this is not something that we're going to tolerate as an organization. I was scheduled today to talk to 400 employees about mission, vision, and values. We postponed that conversation so we could talk about what happened over the last 18 hours. When I came here, my goal was to put a good team on the field and change the culture. And we're not going to be able to do that, change the culture, unless we have very strict and well understood approach to these kinds of situations. They're not going to be tolerated. When I was thinking about this last night, before Steve and I had our conversation, it wasn't just about what's right in this situation. I said to myself, what do Mets employees expect? What does the Mets organization expect in this circumstance? And that weighed very heavily as well. So, in terms of going forward, we're not going to be draconian, but our standards are very high, professionally, personally, and they need to be observed.
Thank you.
Tim Britton, your line is open.
Hey, Sandy, Tim Britton with The Athletic. Kind of piggybacking off of Disha's question, do you alter the vetting process going forward at all, given this? Obviously you weren't here last year with everything that happened with Carlos Beltran, but this is the second straight offseason. The Mets have not been able to get a big name hire to opening day. Do you guys alter the way you go about the vetting process moving forward?
Well, again, these were two different vetting processes, both of which ended up poorly. Look, this is a wake-up call. It clearly suggests that something like this can be out there in connection with almost anyone, and we have to do our best to make sure that we know about that information. But there are limits to what we can actually get, and particularly in a case where this information is aged 4 or 5 years. So it certainly raises questions that we have to reflect upon and decide whether things need to change. But I don't think this reflects a fundamental flaw in the process. I think this is a very unfortunate circumstance that we wish we'd known about, but didn't.
And do you plan on filling that role moving forward in the short term?
I think in the short term, no. What I would expect that with the group that we have now, that we will move forward toward the end of the off season and move into the regular spring training, the regular season. It was late in the process when we made the search for the general manager. It's even later now. The other thing is that we're on a certain trajectory. I think a successful one to this point. And while Jared presents a void, I'm very confident in the group that we have that we can move forward and move forward effectively. If you recall, before Jared arrived, we had already signed a couple of free agents. We've done a couple of things since. Jared was those later transactions, but we're very capable of moving ahead at this point. And so I think short answer to your question is no. I don't expect that we're going to fill that spot immediately. I've got very, very much confidence in the people that we have currently.
Anthony DiComo is next.
Hi, Sandy. Anthony DiComo from MLB.com. Just to ask, maybe a little more bluntly, what Steve asked earlier, what was Jared's explanation when you first spoke to him last night?
There was no explanation. It was really a recounting of what happened. was very, as I said in the original press release, he was apologetic, he was remorseful, he took responsibility, etc. So there wasn't really a good explanation for what happened. I wouldn't have expected a good explanation for what happened.
And also, you mentioned, first thing this morning, you spoke to Steve. What was his reaction when you first addressed this with him?
Well, we both arrived at the same conclusion independently. So when we talked, it was a very short conversation. And almost immediately thereafter, I placed a call to Jared.
Good. Thank you. Next up is Mike Vaccaro.
Sandy, two questions. One, short of changing the law, where you would have access to someone's text messages before you interview them, is there any way to guard against this when an employee is clearly willing to lie in response to the question, do you have anything that, that we should know about? And secondly, have you heard from any players at all in the last 24 hours?
I've not heard from any players. I know that one anonymous player voiced his opinion. I wish he'd had the comfort to voice that opinion himself for attribution. It was the right thing to say. But I have not heard from players. As I mentioned earlier, we did have a roughly 400 employee Zoom call earlier today to talk about this situation.
Also, this is my first question. I mean, if a job candidate is going to, essentially lie to you in response to the basic question, is there anything else we should know about? Is there anything, you or any employer can do in terms of, preventing this, or are you kind of just reliant on that person's word?
Well, so we did a routine background check. We didn't do, an FBI equivalent investigation. Are those the kinds of things that we might have to consider in the future? Perhaps. But when you're hiring, and of course, general managers is different, but we've been hiring, I don't know, a dozen or so individuals over the last month or so, and that risk exists with every employee that's hired.
Thank you, Sandy. Next up is Ken Davidoff.
Ken Davidoff, New York Post. Sandy, two quick ones, technical. So when you say you're not going to fill the post, are you the head of baseball operations in your mind? Is that the hierarchy?
In my mind, I have been since I was hired. So that doesn't change. I think that, again, my attention to the baseball side will increase somewhat, and we'll see how things develop. One of the things I was very happy with was the way that the team, the front office team, was developing as a group, led by Jared. Jared was very energetic. He was knowledgeable. And I was really happy with the way that, the direction that we were taking. So that's a secondary consequence of this situation. But I'll be a little more involved. But again, I've got great faith in our group, and sure that, they will be able to step up.
An interesting term, like, would Zach run the meetings as the assistant GM, or is it, when it's not, doesn't rise to your level, I guess?
Yeah. So, that's something that I'll be discussing with the group, and in particular, Zach. Not something that I've done yet. So maybe I'll answer that question for you in the next 2 or 3 days.
Okay. And was Jared fired for cause?
Yes.
Thank you.
Next question will come from Justin Toscano.
Hey, Sandy, Justin Toscano, Bergen Record. As somebody in a position of power, what's your message for women in the sports industry or pursuing it who might feel rather discouraged about this Jared Porter situation and others that might have happened like it?
My message, I think, is don't be discouraged. I think that the incident itself is discouraging. I think the response to it by the Mets organization should be encouraging.
Thank you.
Next up is Joel Sherman.
Sandy, considering that Zach Scott finished second for this job, for the GM job, is there a reason not to either elevate him to the position and or give him an interim title? And either way, is he now under consideration for the full-time job, however long the term is that you're considering before you make a hire?
So that's a follow-up question to one I just answered. I think the answer is, Joel, that, we're, 18 hours or so out from when this incident first occurred to where we are today. And some of those discussions haven't taken place, but you're right to speculate about that. As I said, I hope we resolve that in the next day or two.
Can I just follow up by asking, sure, would it make sense, considering how blindsided you were by this issue, to just, hey, we hired this guy to be the assistant general manager, let's just live with that for the 2021 season and see how he does that job, and then just consider everything else after the season instead of elevations, et cetera, which would essentially mean you doing the GM job for the 2021 season?
Yeah, look, those are among our choices, but I think you're right to point out that one logical approach is for us to, maintain the same direction that we've had, except the void we have currently. Maybe I do a little more, maybe Zach does a little more, and we meet somewhere in the middle, and then we preserve our options going forward. So I think that's a real possibility. As I said, how we decide to do that formally, I'll let you know in the next couple of days.
Next question comes from Hannah Kaiser.
Hi, Hannah Kaiser from Yahoo Sports. You mentioned being especially caught off guard by this because you said you talked to tons of people in the industry and didn't hear a dissenting voice about Jared. I'm curious if any of the people you spoke to were women.
No. That's one of the unfortunate circumstances that exists in the game today. There aren't women in those positions with whom one can have a conversation and develop information or check references.
Something to consider going forward.
Yes.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Hannah. Next up is Tim Healy.
Sandy, Tim Healy from Newsday here. You touched on it earlier, but I lost your audio a little bit. What effect does losing your GM in mid-January have on the other roster decisions, front office additions that you have coming together that are, in the works or in negotiations?
Well, I would say one of the things that we will be lacking is sort of the same breadth of contacts and information that we were able to get through Jared. Jared has lots of contacts in the game, not just the GM level, the assistant GM level and below. And that's a rich source of information and can lead to, smaller deals that fill out our roster, our 40 man, as well as our 25. And that's an area where we're going to have to pick it up. In the larger transactions, that's where I'm mostly involved. Whether it was signing the free agents or making the trade for Lindor. So, I'm comfortable we're able to work well in the, in both categories. But if I were to say that Jared is going to be missed in any area, it's really in the smaller deals like the one we announced today, where we're filling out the roster, creating depth, and looking for, players that may be undervalued. But again, our staff, we've already added to our R&D staff. Zach is very analytical. Our pro scouting department is very good. So, we're very capable. We just have to shift.
Thank you.
Next up is Ron Blum.
Hi, Sandy. To
Ron?
avoid situations like this in the future, are there things that the Mets as a club can do in terms of an FBI type investigation, or is that something that MLB should institute through the Department of Investigations league-wide to screen out issues like this?
I would not put this on Major League Baseball. I think that this is a club responsibility. We have to do whatever we think is necessary to ensure that we're hiring well-vetted employees. And I think what this situation suggests is that we need to rethink what constitutes well-vetted.
And do you have the ability as a private employer to institute an FBI type investigation, or would that be unfeasible?
It's a good question, Ron. I'm not a legal expert, but I would say with the consent of the employee, the answer would be yes, we would probably have the right to do that. And that would go well beyond, a typical background check. That's not to say that any sort of investigation of that sort would have turned this information up either, given the fact that it's almost 5 years old.
Barry Bloom, your line is open.
Hey, Sandy, how are you?
Hey, Barry.
Do you know whether there's an investigation from Major League Baseball now being opened into Jared at all, and how it would affect him?
I don't know the answer to that precisely. I suspect that there will be. Major League Baseball takes these kinds of situations very seriously. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some sort of investigation with some sort of consequence. I'm not sure how significant that consequence can be above what we've already done.
And Steve has had issues to deal with like this in other companies that he runs. What did he learn from that, which was applied to this situation? I mean, it's been such a short time since he's owned the Mets.
Well, I don't know what he's learned from those situations. I can only tell you that from his standpoint, the integrity of the organization, the ethical conduct of all of our employees, their professionalism, their personal conduct in a myriad of ways is important, because each of us represents the Mets to somebody. And anytime the Mets are associated with this kind of conduct, we take a hit. And, we are the sum of all the impressions we make, good and bad. And, when these kinds of situations arise, we have to respond appropriately. in the best interest of the organization. As I said, as in my case, as a representative not only of the owner but all of our employees.
Mike Puma, your line is open.
Hi, Sandy. Mike Puma from the New York Post. Just wondering, with John Ricco kind of back in the mix in baseball operations, as somebody who has done a lot of stuff, basically done the job before, how valuable a resource that is, and if maybe he takes on an increased role in baseball operations.
Yeah, no, John has been with the Mets a long time. He was my assistant previously in New York. He has a somewhat broader role now, but he's still very involved in baseball. We have daily meetings of our, of 7 or 8 of us in the baseball operations area. He's on that call. So whether he takes on additional responsibilities or not, I don't know, but he's very intimately involved already.
And who are, besides Zach and John, who are the other key members of your cabinet right now that you consider?
Tommy Tanis, who runs, all of our amateur international scouting. The head of pro scouting, Brent Alderson. Ben Zosmer, recently hired from the Dodgers, who's now overseeing some of our R&D. Someone else from the R&D department is on those calls, Joe Lefkowitz. Probably Ian Levin, who runs, all of our administration and other things. So we got a pretty varied group.
Good. Bradford Davis, your line is open.
Hi, Sandy. Bradford Davis from the New York Daily News. I'm curious, how will your, sort of approach of having a high standard, I think the word phrase used was zero tolerance, apply to players you're vetting, whether through the draft, trade discussions, free agency, et cetera?
We have to be mindful of the same standards with respect to players as we have for employees. That doesn't mean that, any one thing will disqualify someone, but we have to be mindful of those same situations.
All right. And if I can follow, and the notice is sort of touched in various questions, but when you agreed to work for the Mets again under Steve Cohen, did you discuss I guess the various accusations, and even since then the against his work environment, .72 to be clear, and then since then the unsealed gender discrimination case that was just out maybe a week or two ago. I'm curious if you guys have discussed that and and what's your thoughts.
So what we just I'm sorry. So what we discussed was my vision for the organization, and my vision involved a very significant emphasis on integrity, on ethical behavior, on moral courage, because we were trying to create an environment that was able to be, that could be successful, but would be known for how it succeeded. And Steve was totally on board with that approach. In fact, he insisted on it. Now, was that informed by situations that arose at .72? I can't answer that question, but I can tell you that he's totally committed to this approach with the Mets. And I think our decision this morning reflects that.
Maggie Gray, your line is open.
Sandy, 2 for you, if you don't mind. Maggie Gray, by the way, from WFAN. You just sort of answered it there, but I'm curious, we talk about culture and you talked about changing the culture when you came back to the Mets. And I'm curious if this situation has made you think differently about how to achieve that different culture.
Honestly, I don't think it's changed my view on how to accomplish that. I think it's reinforced a view I already had. This culture has to change from within and not necessarily top down. It has to be top down and bottom up. And, you know, as I said, the original purpose of our call today was to talk about values, you know, vision. And the purpose of the call was not for me to talk about it, but to go into smaller groups and have our employees talk about it and make sure that what we're doing is we're incorporating those ideas and shaping those ideas that come from all of our employees into something that reflects what we're trying to do. You know, the reason we're having the conversations to begin with is I've said, look, we keep talking about this new culture. Well, so what is it? What are we trying to achieve here? And we need a frame of reference. And that was what this was all about. But the frame of reference is going to be developed by our employees. And not to say that I won't have some influence over her, Steve, but this is an organization-wide effort to establish, you know, what we want the club to represent.
Just a follow-up to that, what was the response from the employees, or if you can share any response from those talks or groups today discussing Jared's situation?
There were a few follow-up questions, but very few. I think if I had to gauge the general response, because I haven't canvassed every individual or even many after the call. I think there was, you know, virtually unanimous agreement as to what decision we made. And I think there was appreciation for what the decision represented for them and for what we're trying to create with the Mets. Does that answer your question? No, it doesn't. Okay. My best shot.
No, she nodded.
Okay.
Maggie, did you have a follow-up or are you okay?
Thank you, Sandy. I was muted. Thank you.
Next question is from David Waldstein.
Dave Waldstein, New York Times. Hi, Sandy.
Hey, Dave.
Thanks for doing this, by the way. You in your conversation with Jared, and maybe anyone else with the other clubs or with MLB or anybody, is there any indication that this had happened more than once? Something like that.
No, not to our knowledge.
Next up is Mark Carrig.
Hi, Sandy. Mark Carrig with The Athletic. You've described this behavior as clearly unacceptable, yet this man was promoted, moved on to other organizations, got promoted again, became one of 30 GMs. And you just said earlier, you didn't hear a single cross word about the guy. What does that say about where the culture of baseball is when it comes to the treatment of women?
Honestly, look, the fact that, as was pointed out in an earlier question, there was not one single recommendation from a woman. And that's a reflection of the demographics of the game today in front offices. So I think that says something very loudly. On the other hand, I don't believe that any of the people who were references could have predicted this from their professional relationship with Jared. I just, it's very hard for me to indict either an industry beyond what I just said about a lack of women or the individuals we talk to, who I think are, upstanding, reliable, and not sure that they should have, had any more insight into this than we did.
I mean, Sandy, to follow up, today you've seen there have been, women that work in the industry or in media that have relayed a lot of stories in which
yes,
describe, that this is I don't want to use the wrong word, but commonplace or not uncommon? How do you respond to, the industry being painted in that light?
Well, I saw an article that was written earlier today, and I was very sorry to read, the degree to which the writer was subjected to, this kind of harassment. I think it's an indictment of the industry, but I think more broadly, it's an indictment of our society. I think this happens lots of places, and it's tolerated too many places. And at least with respect to MLB, there's a policy to deal with this and deal with it harshly. And hopefully, as we go on, these kinds of incidents will become fewer and fewer. But I think this is more of an indictment of our society than it is just about the industry.
Okay, we have time for two more. Justin Walters, your line is open.
Hi, Sandy. Justin Walters, Pix 11 News. We saw in the story by ESPN that one employee at least was aware of Porter's behavior. You mentioned how female reporters should at least be encouraged by the swift action by the Mets today. How much onus also falls on males to make sure that they're holding their counterparts accountable for all this behavior, and not just for women stepping up and talking about their stories, because that's how some of the real change is going to begin.
No, I totally agree. I think men should be accountable. And as I said, I think this is a sort of a societal problem. We view sometimes men and women view these situations somewhat differently. And that's a result of at least in my case, men being less sensitive to these issues, which is why we get back to the importance of diversity in a front office or in an organization. It's important that different sensitivities are reflected in not decision-making, but in, assessing the situation and determining, what's appropriate. So no, you're right. It's not about putting the onus on women. I hope I wasn't misunderstood that way. The onus is on all of us to root this out where it exists. And as I said, I wouldn't just indict Major League Baseball on this this particular incident, but I think it's reflective of larger problems we have. And maybe they're somewhat more prevalent in professional sports. I'm probably not somebody that knows, but based on what I've read as recently as today, perhaps that's the case.
Final question is for Jennifer Williams. Or I'm sorry, Jennifer, do you still have a question? Or
no, it was just answered. Thank you.
You're welcome. Then let's go ahead and we will end with a final question from Rich Catino.
Hey, Sandy, you just kind of talked about the diversity and how important is not only the diversity in the baseball business and all businesses, but the importance of having that diversity in senior management, because in this situation, maybe this could have come to light if there were more diversities in the senior management of the sport in general.
Well, I agree with your original, premise. There does need to be more diversity across the industry. We need more diversity at the Mets. I'm not sure, though, in this particular case, just because of the remote aspect of the event and, the passage of time, that would have been helpful to us. But where it would be helpful, and I think where Major League Baseball has made a lot of strides in terms of, providing education and, more experience understanding these and giving us more sort of insight into how to address these situations, or even before addressing them, recognizing them. So diversity has many benefits. Perhaps that's one. And maybe that would have been useful in this case. I don't know.
Thank you.
Sandy, thank you very much. And we'd also like to thank everybody else for participating on today's call.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Happy birthday to Ken Davidoff.
Stay well, everybody. Bye-bye.